He followed every rule they told him would keep him safe, kept his head down, worked twice as hard, believed that discipline and effort could protect him from judgment. But in one ordinary moment, under ordinary circumstances, he was reduced to a stereotype before he was seen as a human being. No shouting, no violence, just a quiet decision that would change the direction of his life forever. What happened next wasn't loud, but it was devastating. And it raises a question we still avoid answering. What do you do when prejudice quietly closes every door in front of you? But this moment didn't come out of nowhere. To understand how it all began, you have to see the life he was building before everything fell apart. Before everything unraveled, Arav lived a life built on routine and quiet determination. His mornings began before sunrise, not because life demanded it, but because he believed discipline was his only way forward. He worked a modest job, saved every extra rupee, and carried himself with the careful confidence of someone who knew he had to be better just to be treated the same. In his neighborhood, he was known as dependable, respectful, invisible in the safest way possible. Arav believed that if he followed the rules closely enough, the world would meet him halfway. He dressed neatly, spoke politely, avoided trouble, and kept his ambitions private. Success to him was not loud or flashy. It was stability. It was dignity. It was earning a future without asking anyone for favors. But there were signs he chose not to read. The lingering looks when he entered certain spaces. The subtle shift in tone when he introduced himself. The unspoken assumption that he needed to prove his innocence before his worth. He told himself it was nothing. That patience would smooth everything over. After all, he had worked too hard to let suspicion define him. On the day everything changed, nothing felt unusual at first. The streets were familiar. The air felt heavy but calm. Arav moved forward with the same steady pace he always had, unaware that he was being judged long before he was noticed. Somewhere along the way, his efforts stopped mattering, and his identity began to speak louder than his actions. What Arav didn't know was that this ordinary day was quietly setting him up for a moment that would expose how fragile respect can be when prejudice decides the rules. And as the tension beneath the surface began to rise, the life he trusted started slipping out of his control. One silent assumption at a time, AT first, the change was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Arav began to feel watched in places where he had once felt safe. Doors that used to open with polite nods now paused before letting him through. Simple processes took longer when his name appeared on a form, his face appearing to raise unspoken questions. Each moment on its own seemed small, almost harmless. Together, they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. The tension sharpened when opportunity finally came within reach. A position that promised stability, growth, and dignity. Everything Arav had disciplined himself for stood just one evaluation away. His record was clean, his performance consistent, his effort undeniable. Yet during the final stage, the atmosphere shifted. The room felt colder, the smiles thinner. His achievements were scrutinized with unusual intensity, while others were waved forward with ease. It wasn't what was said that unsettled him. It was what wasn't. Soon, obstacles began piling up faster than explanations could follow. Additional checks, extra verifications, delays that made no sense. Arav watched as time stretched, as uncertainty gnawed at his confidence. He started questioning himself, replaying every action, every word, wondering where he had gone wrong. But deep down, a quieter truth began to surface. This wasn't about effort anymore. It never had been. Outside those walls, the pressure followed him home. Neighbors grew distant. Familiar faces avoided eye contact. Rumors moved faster than facts, shaped by fear rather than truth. Arav felt the weight of being defined before being understood. His discipline, once his shield, now felt painfully fragile against assumptions he couldn't control. Each step forward demanded more restraint, more patience, more silence. Speaking up felt dangerous. Staying quiet felt like surrender. Nights grew longer as sleep slipped away, replaced by the heavy question of whether proving himself would ever be enough. The injustice wasn't explosive. It was slow, methodical, and exhausting. And that made it worse. The breaking point came when the opportunity he had worked toward quietly slipped out of his hands. No clear reason, no explanation, that matched reality. Just a vague justification that left no room for appeal. In that moment, something inside Arav cracked, not loudly but deeply. Years of discipline, sacrifice, and self-control suddenly felt invisible. Anger followed, then fear. Not the fear of losing a job, but of losing belief. Belief that fairness existed. Belief that consistency was rewarded. Belief that his identity wouldn't always outweigh his character. He stood at a crossroads where effort met prejudice, and prejudice refused to move. What hurt most was realizing how alone the experience was. How easily the system moved on. How quietly injustice could ruin someone without leaving a mark anyone else cared to see. And just when Arav thought the damage was done, a single moment would force him to choose between accepting the silence or confronting the truth head-on, no matter the cost. The moment arrived without warning, but its weight felt inevitable. Arav was called in one last time, told this was only a formality, nothing to worry about. Yet the air in the room was heavy, pressing down on his chest as if it already knew the outcome. His records lay open in front of them, pages filled with proof of discipline, consistency, and effort. Still, the decision had been made long before he entered. The explanation came slowly, carefully worded, stripped of responsibility. They spoke of concerns, of fit, of things that could not be measured or challenged. Each sentence landed like a quiet blow. Arav felt his heartbeat in his ears, his hands tightening at his sides as he realized there would be no appeal, no second chance, no acknowledgement of what had truly happened. Years of restraint held him frozen in place. In that instant, fear and anger collided. Not explosive anger, but something heavier, an aching awareness of how easily a life can be redirected by bias. He wanted to speak, to demand honesty, to force them to say what they were thinking. But he understood the risk. He understood how quickly he could be labeled difficult, aggressive, ungrateful. Silence became the price of survival. As he stepped outside, the world moved on without him. People passed by, unaware that something had just been taken from him that could never be returned. The sun felt too bright, the noise too loud. Arav stood still, realizing this wasn't just a rejection. It was a reminder of his place in a system that claimed fairness while practicing exclusion. Then something shifted. Beneath the hurt, a spark of clarity emerged. This moment, as devastating as it was, had stripped away every illusion. It was no longer about proving himself to those who refused to see him. It was about deciding what he would do with the truth he now carried. Because if silence allowed injustice to survive, then what came next would determine whether his story ended here, or became something far bigger than a single lost opportunity. The moment arrived without warning, yet it felt like everything had been quietly leading here. Arav was called in one final time and told it was just a formality, nothing more. Still, the air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. His file lay open on the table, filled with proof of years of discipline, effort, and consistency. But even before a word was spoken, he sensed the truth. The decision had already been made. The explanation came carefully, wrapped in neutral language meant to sound fair. Words like concerns and overall fit were used to soften the blow, but they only deepened it. There were no specifics, no mistakes he could correct, no reason he could challenge. Each sentence stripped away another layer of hope until the reality became impossible to deny. This wasn't about performance. It never had been. Arav felt his chest tighten, his breath grow shallow. Fear mixed with anger, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that sits heavy in the stomach. He wanted to speak, to demand honesty, to ask them to say what they were really thinking. But he knew the cost. One wrong tone, one wrong word, and the narrative would turn against him. Silence became his only shield. When he stepped outside, the world didn't pause. People walked past him, laughing, scrolling, living their lives, unaware that something vital had just been taken from him. The sun burned brighter than it should have. The noise of the street felt overwhelming. In that moment, Arav understood that this wasn't just rejection. It was erasure, a reminder that no amount of discipline could fully protect him from prejudice. And yet beneath the pain, something shifted. The illusion was gone. The truth stood clear and undeniable. What mattered now wasn't their decision, but what he would do next. Because if silence had allowed this injustice to happen, Then what followed would decide whether his story ended in defeat or became a challenge the world could no longer ignore. Arav did make it home that day, but the version of him who crossed that threshold was not the same one who had left in the morning. Something essential had shifted. The trust he once placed in fairness was gone, replaced by a sharper awareness of how easily dignity can be taken without a single raised voice. The rejection did not leave visible scars, yet it settled deep inside him, reshaping how he saw the world and his place within it. For a long time, Arav carried the weight quietly. He questioned himself, replayed moments, wondered if he could have done more, been more. But slowly, clarity replaced confusion. He understood that the injustice he faced was not a personal failure. It was a reflection of a system that rewards sameness and punishes difference while pretending to be neutral. That realization did not erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. Arav chose not to disappear. He spoke when he could. He shared his experience with those willing to listen. He supported others who carried similar stories but lacked the words or safety to tell them. His discipline, once used only for personal success, became a tool for resilience. Each day, he rebuilt himself, not to prove his worth to those who denied it, but to protect it from being taken again. This story is not unique. It echoes in workplaces, schools, streets, and institutions across the world. Racism does not always arrive with shouting or violence. Often, it comes quietly, hidden behind procedures and polite language, leaving lives altered and opportunities erased without accountability. So the question remains, how many futures have been redirected by prejudice disguised as policy? And how many more will it take before silence is no longer an option? Because change does not begin with systems. It begins the moment we choose to see, to speak, and to refuse to look away.